Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Brian Manning. I'm a financial advisor here in Nashville, Tennessee for Pinnacle Financial Partners, and I'm also the host of the Pinnacle Point webinar and forum series. We're glad you're with us today. At Pinnacle, our brand is built on distinctive service and effective advice. And for us, that means that we want the service you get when you act with our associates here to be far beyond anything that you would expect from a financial services firm. But we also want our firm to stand out for more than just customer service. We hope that when you interact with our associates, you also get effective advice. And over the history of our firm, that's meant bringing you forums like we have today with wonderful speakers like Dr. Bill Fox. And hopefully what that means also is that we gather together with you in communities with other business leaders that allows you the opportunity to connect with them and network and make some new relationships, and also walk away with some information that's helpful to your personal life and hopefully also for your business. Over the last year, that's been a bit of a challenge as gathering people in large groups has been frowned upon. So we've tried to engage with you and further our effective advice through these virtual webinars and forums. So we're thankful that you've engaged with us that way, and we really look forward to being back with you in person very soon. Just a couple of logistics about our event today. We have opened the Q&A function for you to interact with Dr. Fox. If you've got a question as he goes through his presentation, please submit that through the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll try to address those as they come up, and also have a time for Q&A at the end of Dr. Fox's presentation. This will also be recorded and available on our YouTube channel. So if you'll give us about 24 hours or so after the event today to get that posted, you can find it by going to youtube.com/watchpnfp, or just open up your YouTube app on your mobile device and search Watch PNFP. And today's forum, along with many other webinars and videos that we hope you find helpful, will be there. I think that's all of the logistical information out of the way. Now it's my honor to introduce to you Dr. Bill Fox. Dr. Bill Fox is Chancellor's Professor, the Boyd Distinguished Professor of Business, and Director of the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research at the University of Tennessee. He was the 2013-2014 University of Tennessee Macebearer. He is a past president and recipient of the Stephen D. Gold Award from the National Tax Association and former chairman of the Economics Department at the University of Tennessee. He's held visiting appointments as professor at the University of Hawaii. He's a scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City and distinguished Fulbright chair at the University of Frankfurt, Germany. Dr. Fox has served as a consultant to both private and public sectors on a wide range of public policy issues in over 40 countries and 15 U.S. states. We're thankful that we can call Dr. Bill Fox a friend here at Pinnacle. Dr. Fox, thanks for spending a little bit of time with us today. I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's certainly my privilege to be with you today. Let's try to get that all set. There we go. Does that look good to you?
It's perfect.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be with you. I've been friends with the stakeholders and partners at Pinnacle Bank for as long as I can remember, even before the bank existed. And so congratulations on all you've done as a bank and your growth and your successes. And I'm privileged and pleased to be with you today to share in that a little bit. Last time I was with you, it was in person, and I sure wish this could be in person, but we'll deal with what's the hand that's dealt us and do this online. And so I hope we can have a fun exchange on what's going on in the economy. And wow, is there a lot going on in the economy, from inflation data over the last couple of days to decisions on whether we're going to give unemployment insurance claims to what's happening to oil. I mean, it is really a changing time from an economics perspective, and tough to go through all of this and put it together, but we'll see what we can do. So what I'd like to do is talk to you in broad sense about two things. First of all, what's going on in the economy right now? And this is, of course, very heavily influenced by the COVID era and the recession associated with that, and are now coming back out of that very strongly. And then secondly, at the end, I'd like to remind us all that the underlying trends in the economy are still there. Technology change, demographics, maybe some of this got accelerated by COVID, but it didn't change the world in which we're operating. And so I want to remind you some of these things are going to be there when we quit spending all of our time talking about how COVID is impacting everything. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves that the broadest measure of the economy we talk about is GDP, and it just plummeted this time last year, in the second quarter of last year. It rebounded strongly in the third quarter, and there was all this debate about how quickly the recovery would be. Clearly, those who thought the GDP side of the recovery would be really fast, we're on target. We've seen it very healthy. And indeed, by this quarter, we're in the second quarter of 2021. By this quarter, we're going to be back at the same level of production we were at in the pre-pandemic era. So a great recovery. Now, I'll remind you, we're still lower in terms of GDP than we would have been without COVID, because we obviously won't have experienced any growth, but still a good recovery so far. And of course, we're opening up, vaccines are rampant, and unparalleled levels of fiscal and monetary stimulus, which I'll talk about here as we go through our conversation. Here's a list of some of the stimulus that's taken place. This doesn't include the monetary stimulus. Over $5 trillion in the past year. Now, it hasn't all been spent yet, but over $5 trillion has been appropriated. And of course, there's the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan being talked about by the president now that would add even more stimulus to this. And so again, unprecedented as to how it plays out. Now, this chart's a little complicated, but if you just focus your eyes on the on the black line, you can see the main point that I'm trying to emphasize here, and that is, with all this stimulus, we boomed the economy relative to where it would have been. However, as we withdraw that stimulus, that is, we quit giving it, and so people's personal income begins to fall. After all, if you give me $1,400, I have $1,400 of income. And if you don't give it to me next year, then my income is $1,400 lower. And so what we're going to see is some payback as we have the stimulus sliding away, unless, of course, one of these new plans that the president is proposing were to pass. This is, of course, the bad news that all of us are worried about, and that is the magnitude of the deficits that are the result of this. But it's a more complicated story than that. Notice again, I put in here enough years so you could look back and see, well, what did we do in the Great Recession around 2008, 9, 10? And you can see pretty big stimulus, big deficits then, but they were just a shadow of what we've seen in this year and last year with extraordinary levels of deficits, over $3 trillion a year. You may have seen they just came out and noted it's almost $2 trillion after 7 months of the current federal fiscal year. But the bad news associated with that also is that while it gets better, it's no longer $3 trillion. Deficits for every year into the future also exceed $1 trillion a year. And this is a combination of low taxes, and of course, none of us think our personal taxes are low, but they are lower than history in terms of a share of GDP, combined with demographics, which say a whole bunch of people begin getting Medicare and Social Security, and that's what's causing that upward pattern of deficits going forward from here. And so, I mean, it's a complicated issue. Do we just let deficits go on at this magnitude? Do we raise taxes? A conversation you're hearing around the Democrats, although it's all about raising taxes to spend more. It's not about raising taxes to cut deficits, or do we cut spending? And challenging issues. And of course, if we're cutting spending, it has to be around entitlements to make much of a difference. Cutting what we're spending on national parks won't make much difference. Slowing down Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security would. So big challenge for the future right there. And of course, inflation. And we were all at least a little surprised by the magnitude of the consumer price index increase announced a day ago, 4.2%. Everybody knew inflation was going to go up. Most were surprised at how much it went out. And of course, even this morning, the producer price index up again a little bit more than I think most people expected. And so here's the question that, again, there's a lot of disagreement on, and we're going to learn this over the next couple of years. is this temporary? We know, for example, that what happened as a result of COVID was a bunch of prices went down. Airline tickets got cheap, for example. Cars got cheap, for example, and oil got cheap. It actually, if you may remember, it turned negative this time last year for a very brief period of time. And so a bunch of stuff got cheap, and now those prices are coming back in line with what we would have expected. Add that to supply chain woes in areas like vehicles, and what we're getting is this push up in inflation. Now, is this something that's going to be permanent? You know, one-time increase in prices is not so much of a concern. What's a concern is a steady increase over time. That's what we call inflation, when prices go up and up and up and up. And so this is the challenge. And then what does the administration and Congress and the Fed do from here? We have this balance they're trying to work out to keep the economy stimulated. I'll remind you that while we were surprised at how much inflation came up, we were also surprised last week at how few jobs were created in the most recent month, in April. And so, what they're trying to create is this balance of keeping the economy stimulated while not igniting significant inflation in the economy. I'm plenty old enough to remember the inflation of the 1970s, and none of us want to see that again. And so it is a challenge. So far, the Fed has said, look, the Fed's worried about low inflation. It's also worried about a fully employed economy. And they're saying, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, which is this very massive monetary policy, which means very, very low short-term interest rates and a lot of quantitative easing. Minimally, what we may hear if we continue to see this inflation is some reduction in the quantitative easing that's taking place. Well, again, we'll all be able to watch that in coming months and see what the policy response is. But a very, very challenging time for both the fiscal policy and the monetary policy side of things in this world. You can see that you've got to go back to 2008 to see even a month of inflation as high as what we just saw in this month's report. And so it is not unparalleled, but high. And certainly, I know the Fed is paying a lot of attention, and hopefully when they respond, they respond before it gets too late and inflation continues to grow. And of course, inflation is part of the story. Interest rates are another important part of the story. You can see this is the very short term to medium term yield curve, and it is steeper than it was a year ago. But of course, almost all interest rates were close to zero a year ago. We do have the 10-year rate well above where it was a year ago. But if the bond markets thought there was going to be significant amount of inflation, you might have expected, particularly as we get out to 10 and beyond year terms, that the interest rates would have come up, and they haven't, more than they have, and they haven't so much as yet. Of course, if the Fed gets so far along as to want to raise interest rates, we have in the past seen times at which high interest rates have caused contraction in the economy, and the Fed's certainly going to want to avoid that if at all possible. But it also adds to the federal deficit, which, as we noted before, is a challenging issue for us. And so again, it's a very difficult tightrope for the policymakers to walk. And I give them a lot of credit. Things could have been really bad a year ago from an economic perspective without all of this fiscal and monetary stimulus. And now it's even more complicated. How do we reduce it? Well, let's look for a moment at Tennessee and the U.S. and the employment side. Now, I've already said GDP will be back where it was this quarter. Employment is way short where we were a year ago before COVID. And we were about 8 million jobs short at the national level. Tennessee has done better. Now, this chart is a little misleading because we have an extra month of data on the U.S. And one of the things that, again, is challenging as we try to make sense out of what's going on in the economy is for the next 3 or 4 months particularly, as we do year-over-year comparisons, they're going to look extraordinary because last April, much of the economy was shut down in May and June. And so, the U.S. has 8 million fewer workers than a year ago, but it saw an 11% growth rate by comparison with a year ago to get that. And so, relative to last year, things look great. Relative to the levels that we were before the pandemic, we still have a noticeable problem here, to say the very least. And indeed, all the signs are that the labor market, despite having 8 million fewer people working, is tight in many ways. And we'll want to sort of talk about that for a few moments as we go forward. One of the important characteristics of COVID is how differently it affected the states. Now, some of this has been a decision of the states. This is just employment growth across the states. To give you a comparison, there's nothing particularly magic about this set of states other than to show you that some states are actually seeing employment gains by comparison with a year ago. And by the way, some Tennessee counties, as I'll show you in a minute, some states have seen big decreases. New York, they shut down more than many other states. You can see it in their employment effects. Big differences across the U.S. The unemployment rate, of course, has gotten much higher briefly. But frankly, I'm shocked that Tennessee's unemployment rate in the most recent data was down to 5%. It's still higher than we'd like to see it, but a pretty good unemployment rate given the depths of the recession we have and the time it's going to take to come back. Now, in fairness, a fair number of people have left the labor force. Something like 3.5 or 4 million people have left the labor force, and so they're not counted as unemployed. Otherwise, the unemployment rate would look somewhat higher. Now, here's an issue, and this includes this morning's release. Here's an issue that's getting a lot of attention. What about unemployment insurance? And is this the cause of the tightness in the labor market that at least many businesses perceive is taking place? By the way, this is what was released this morning, and this is state unemployment insurance benefits. Notice if you look at that blue line, we always have people who are getting unemployed for a variety of reasons that aren't always their own fault. Companies shut down, they're unsuccessful, demand changes in the market and so forth. And so if you look back, you can hardly tell it, but we were averaging about 2,000 or so initial claims a week prior to the pandemic. We went over 100,000 in a single week. Extraordinary on any, like almost 4 times higher than ever in the history of Tennessee. And then it's slowly come down. But even this morning, it was still over 8,000. And so we're multiples of what we would expect in terms of claims for unemployment insurance still in the economy. And the orange just shows you a proxy for how many weeks of state benefits we're paying out. But a lot of the conversation has been around, is the federal assistance causing people to stay out of the labor force? And it's certainly true that the replacement of earnings by, if you put together federal and state unemployment insurance, can exceed what somebody would have earned in any job they could find or the job that they had before. And we have about 160,000 people getting these federal benefits. And so big numbers, a lot of people involved. Of course, do the arithmetic in your head here real fast. We're giving $300 a week extra to 160,000 people. This is like $50 million. So this is real money in the economy as well. That's part of why we're seeing so much demand in the economy. And so there's two sides to this. I mean, here's my guess. That, as many of you are aware, Governor Lee announced the other day that he felt we needed to eliminate the federal benefits in early July, with the notion that we need to give people every incentive to get back to work, and employers need people back to work. And my guess is a number of those people will in fact take jobs after we cut the federal benefits. I don't think it will solve the shortage of the problem, shortage in the labor market, but it will help. It will be a step in the right direction. And I think as we go through into the fall, we'll see it gets better as kids are fully back in school and parents work out their child care arrangements for the coming school year, and maybe some of the discouraged workers get back to work. And so this is a really difficult policy issue and challenging for every state to address. This is employment by industry. Now, I'll remind you, this is March to March. So this is it's based on the week of March the 12th. And so this is before COVID really had its impact on the economy. In fact, I was in Nashville March 11th doing a speech last year. I attended a game of the SEC championship, and as they canceled it kind of after the game that I attended. It wasn't a UT game. I just happened to be in town and went. And so this is mostly a comparison pre-pandemic. Once we get the April data next week, we'll now be seeing comparisons with the drop off the cliff that took place last year, and so things will look better. But this gives us a better picture of how things compared before the pandemic, and you can see most industries have fewer workers than they did before. Trade and transportation, obviously, I'll be driving later this evening to Nashville, and I know I'll have a lot of trucks next to me. Transportation is booming. Professional and business services, and particularly science areas, are doing very well. Obviously, at the bottom, leisure and hospitality doing very poorly, but coming back strongly. What we're seeing is a lot of growth in services, and I'll show you a chart in a few minutes that shows you what's happened on the good side. And what happened, of course, in many cases, was very fast growth in goods purchases. And as services went down, well, we're going to see that kind of reverse itself now, and we're going to see, I think, goods purchases slowing in many categories, while services, restaurants and hotels and airline flights and elective healthcare grow again much more rapidly. This just gives you a little quick picture of what's happening across Tennessee counties. Those in kind of light gray or green actually have employment gains by comparison with a year ago, 19 of them. As you can see, they're essentially all pretty rural, small counties. The counties where much of the population live tend all to have noticeable declines, including in Middle Tennessee, which has been one of the strong areas, of course, of Tennessee's economy for some years. Tax revenues in Tennessee. So a year ago, I was spending a lot of my time talking with people about what's going to happen to tax revenues. We all feared the worst. We did not have the worst. Just look back at this chart, which shows you how taxes did in 2009-10, and you can see that nothing like that took place. Now, we did see a slowing of growth rates, but that was it. And indeed, now, let me remind you again, this is data through March. So somewhere in the next week or so, they'll begin to talk about, well, April's tax collections and then May. We're going to be comparing ourselves now with COVID months. And so we're going to see, I think, much stronger growth rates in taxes as we look at the rest of the fiscal year. And so while there's been a lot of talk about how state governments across the country were impacted by COVID and their lost tax revenues, that's really not true of Tennessee. It's not true of many states. Kentucky recently noted that their sales tax collections were the highest in their history for the most recent month. And you see this in many other states, including states like California, where we might have thought of there being problems, but their income tax did very well. And sales taxes in most states have done well for a reason I'll show you in just a moment. This just shows you sales tax collections. You can see there, that sharp reduction in sales tax collections for a month or two, but now they're back growing at healthy paces. Remembering even at the inflation rates we have, which at least over the last year has been just a couple percent, this is very positive in real terms. And so people are out buying sales taxable items. Now, a little bit of the story, this is sort of a tax question that most of you haven't thought about. I'll just remind you this. A little bit of the story of what's taken place on taxes is that there was a Supreme Court decision back in 2018 that allowed Tennessee and other states to begin collecting sales taxes on remote transactions. And so starting in October of 19, Tennessee required large vendors to collect our sales tax. So that was like Amazon, although Amazon was already collecting it. Wayfair was one that began to collect for us. And then in October of 20, we required any large marketplace facilitators. Again, think Amazon, but now the Amazon platform, Walmart, Etsy, eBay to collect our sales tax for us. And you can see what happened. This is based on self-reporting of firms to the Department of Revenue that are collecting for the first time in Tennessee as a result of this legislation. And you can see huge amounts of revenue coming in as a result of this new rule. And then to add to it, this is what I mentioned before, how consumers change their behavior in the midst of COVID. And so this is retail sales data nationally, and this is not for the most recent month. And the reason I'm showing you this is my intent is to show you how COVID changed behavior. If you look at the most recent month, of course, so we're comparing April with last April. Well, none of us were spending anything last April, and so it looks like we're booming in all categories. But this really shows how we've changed our behavior. First of all, we went non-store retailers, just think e-commerce. And of course, what's listed here are firms that are pure e-commerce firms. Walmart, Target, firms like that saw extraordinary growth in their e-commerce sales, and in the 100% range, as all of us bought our items, bought our toilet paper if we could find it online. But notice what also happened. We bought sporting goods, Pelotons, kayaks. We bought building materials. We got our kitchen redone. We food and beverage stores. We quit going out to eat. We went to grocery stores and so forth. And so only at the bottom where we saw some categories, smaller stores, and of course it says electronic stores, and that's because we all bought our electronics online. And then food service places were hit. Big transition. Now, expect a lot of this to begin to slowly reverse as consumers go out and they buy more services. They go out, and that means they don't have to buy a Peloton, or they already have a Peloton, but they don't need another one, and they can go outside for their exercise. And so we're going to see a lot of reversing into services, and since this is retail sales, it mostly does not show what we think of as services. And just to show you one of the big ticket items here, this is light vehicle sales, and you can see they plummeted. They're back up. Of course, the challenge now, and this is part of the inflation problem we're seeing in the economy. The challenge now is supply chain issues in a number of industries, not the least of which is in vehicles. It's pushed up the prices of vehicles since they can't produce as many as they would like. And of course, I'll remind you that Tennessee is a big manufacturer, assembler of automobiles, and so this can be important to our state without a doubt. And you can see that we've gotten back to pretty good levels. The supply chain is a little bit of an issue, but I think what we're going to see is continued slowing. I'm now setting aside the short term, continued slowing in the number of light vehicles that people purchase. A final comment on the tax implication here. I know there's people from various parts of Tennessee on here. This requirement that firms collect these remote firms collect our sales tax has had really big impacts on counties and on county revenues, and for some technical reasons as well. And so you can see here that rural counties, particularly in Tennessee, McMinn, 46% growth in sales tax collections year to date. Murray, 47%. Excellent growth, much of this driven by the e-commerce changes and how we're collecting the tax. But of course, Davidson County impacted continuing by the loss of conventions and tourism and other things. Now let me turn just for a few minutes to the long term and mention a few factors for you to keep in mind as you think, not just how do I respond to COVID, but what's going to be impacting me in the long term. And so first of all, I wanted to just show you where jobs are being created in our economy. And this is starting December of 2007. So think right before the Great Recession. Where have we seen job growth, even with the effects of COVID having played out to some extent? And the answer is it's in the professional services areas. It's in education and healthcare, financial. I mean, you can see it's all service categories. Look at the goods part of the economy and construction and manufacturing, continuing with many fewer workers than were available or were required prior to the Great Recession. So we've never recovered the employment in a number of these sectors. That has to do with technology changes, has to do with changes in which each of us spend our money. We are spending increasingly amounts on services and relatively smaller amounts on goods. And then if we think about this geographically, again, I don't think anybody is surprised by this. Nashville easily is leading the state in terms of job creation, followed by Clarksville, and think of that as, in some sense, one big economy with excellent growth. And then next to that mostly is the Cleveland, Chattanooga area, but clearly Middle Tennessee is exceeding it. So as we think long term, what we're seeing is rapid growth in services and much of the employment growth taking place in Middle Tennessee. By the way, notice that a number of metro areas actually have fewer workers than they did in December of '07. So then three sort of comments about long-term trends. First of all, what did COVID do? And I don't want to, unless you have questions, go through this in great detail, but essentially what I think COVID has done is to accelerate a lot of the trends that were already underway. Retail and restaurant jobs are going away as you and I change the way in which we spend and buy more online. And of course, many people learned for the first time, hey, guess what? I can order my groceries and just drop by and pick them up. And when we get to autonomous vehicles, which I'll talk about in a moment, when we get to autonomous vehicles, I don't even need to drop by and pick it up. I can have the autonomous vehicle bring it to me. And so what happens is retail space shifts from having you and I come in the store and searching across a lot of commodities to a situation in which it's offering fulfillment instead. And so, probably a lot of retail space closed down and a lot more fulfillment in the back end of stores. I mean, again, the example I always give on this is, you go into a store and you walk down the aisle and you have pickers in there in your way because they're picking for 6 people, and it kind of frustrates me. Well, the reality is what the stores, and this is Walmart and Target and grocery stores, they're all paying one person to put it on the shelf and a second person to pull it off the shelf. This cannot be the way the economy is going to operate in the long term. We're going to never put it on the shelf and make it available to people. And then, of course, the use of technology in all kinds of businesses. I mean, this is an example right here. We're doing remote discussions with each other. We're doing teleoffice and telemedicine. We're not going to undo this. Now, I hope the next time I interact with the Pinnacle stakeholders that we can do that in person, but all of us have learned that a lot of meeting can be done through WebEx or Zoom or one of these other technologies, and it works pretty well for many of our meetings. All of this leaves us with an economy with a lot fewer low-skilled workers. And I just threw this in to remind you the point I've made about retailers. This is a list of ones that have filed for bankruptcy in the last year or so. And again, I'm not suggesting that all these are going to shut down. I am suggesting that they're going to restructure their business, and it will mean fewer workers going forward in the economy. And then technology more generally. This just shows you how long it takes to adopt various kinds of technologies. And this is prior to the pandemic. What the pandemic has done is to cause us to accelerate even more our use of technology. And you can see it at the right end. These lines are straight up. We all have our cell phones here. And our use of cell phones, smartphones specifically, we adopted these things incredibly fast. And so, I'm expecting the same thing with technology. What this means is that whether I'm a business leader or I'm an employee or I'm a student, the requirement that I adapt and change rapidly is much stronger. And so it puts a lot more pressure on all of us to stay on top of it and respond really quickly. The example I often talk about, and I'm sure I mentioned this when I was with Pinnacle a year and a half or so ago, that I think electric autonomous vehicles is where the world is going. And you can see the electric vehicles already, fortunately, and I give Governor Lee and Governor Haslam to some extent the credit for recognizing where we're going as a country. And so they've helped facilitate having electric car manufacturing in Middle Tennessee at the GM plant, at the Volkswagen plant, having batteries in Clarksville and again, next to the GM facility and other things, recognizing the world is changing and changing fast. And we are highly tied to current vehicles, with about a little less than 3% of us manufacturing and nearly 5% who are financing or insuring or selling or repairing these internal combustion engine vehicles. And you know, the number of parts and the repairs and so forth are really going to be differently. And again, almost 14% of us using them intently in our job. All that means more than 1 out of 5 people in Tennessee, their job depends on current forms of mobility in a world that changes. And as we go to autonomous vehicles, in my view, they're going to be owned by, not by you and me as a general rule, but by mobility companies like Uber or Lyft or Waymo or some other company or companies, and will be offered really through us just in fleets. And we'll see adoption of electric vehicles then much, much faster. Technology is changing fast. This is maybe the biggest place in which we're going to see it, but it's only one of many areas where these evolving technologies are impacting every one of us and how we do business. And then the demographics and how that's changing. You may have seen last week when the census came out and reported on the 2020 population, the lowest growth rate we've had in population since the 1930s. And of course, the 1930s was a really unique time period, and so you know, it's really an aberration. What we're seeing now is not an aberration based on what's taking place. We're simply seeing U.S. population grow slowly, and more slowly than we'd ever seen before. And an important part of that is because birth rates are very, very low. Now notice this, I happen to draw just through 2018. So this does not include the impact of COVID on birth rates, which brought them down even more. And the thing I like to emphasize here is that, you know, I'm showing you 2007. So this is not way long ago, just a decade or so ago, and how much birth rates have fallen since then. And this is like, you know, the apple going through the snake, this demographic effect. 5 years from now, a bunch fewer kids hitting elementary schools. 12 years from now, a bunch fewer kids hitting middle schools. 15 years, high schools. 18 years, colleges and universities. It's going to play its way through. But 20 years from now, fewer people hitting our labor force. Fewer people as part of the demand in the economy. And so you know, this trend, which again has been underway for decades and decades and decades, but has accelerated over the last 10 or so years, is reason for concern, and for the labor force as well. And here's a picture that I think illustrates this. I've divided employment into 3 categories, or people into 3 categories. The top one, that's the labor force. And the thing to see is that traditional working age population declines for the foreseeable future. And what that means is fewer workers available for you, more dependence on technology. I joked in a talk I was doing yesterday that when I'm in the nursing home a few years from now, I'm going to be having a robot coming down the hall, bringing me my pills and taking me down to get my dinner. There may be some need for that because we simply won't have the workers. Now, obviously, in-migration from outside the U.S. is a possible option. There's a lot of political and other reasons around that to think that's probably not going to happen at a strong pace. And so we're likely to have to work with a labor force, which is a much smaller share of our population. And the red is showing you the young people. I think, again, this actually understates how much that's declining, this particular forecast. It's declining faster. And what's happening, of course, is the purple part evidencing that the aging of the population is clearly the significant force in the economy. I actually received something today that I read each day about what's happening to remote sales and e-commerce, and it was just making the point that the baby boomer crowd and so forth represent a huge portion of demand going forward, a huge portion of the country's wealth, and raising the question, how well are many retailers and service providers responding to the fact that that's where a lot of the wealth is concentrated. And while we're seeing new nursing homes and assisted living facilities on every corner, the baby boomer and older crowd have much broader demands for that. And are we effectively targeting them? So that's kind of where I came to make some prepared comments about. Again, the economy is growing. It's growing at a very fast pace. We're going to see GDP this year of over 6%. An extraordinary number. We'll still again lie a little under where we could have been without COVID, but the economy doing really well. Employment a little slower in terms of its response. So Brian, I'd be happy to respond to comments or questions, anything you have.
Well, Dr. Fox, again, thank you for the time. And I would remind everyone that this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel. Give us a day or so to go through and edit and post it. But you can find that by going to youtube.com/watchpnfp, or just go to the YouTube app and search Watch PNFP. And you can see Dr. Fox's presentation and go back and review that if you missed anything today. Dr. Fox, we did have a couple of questions that came in while you were talking. The state of Tennessee has been very popular for a lot of corporate relocations recently, and would love for you to share your perspective on how you feel like the state of Tennessee will be able to fill lots of those jobs created by the relocation of those corporations. And additionally, what do you think will be necessary from an education standpoint in order to be able to fill those jobs effectively?
Yeah, as you know, many of those jobs and those headquarters are in the Nashville area, and just extraordinary successes with Amazon and Alliance Bernstein. I'm sorry, I don't want to leave anybody out here, so I hate to start listing names, Oracle, and you just go through the list of national brands that have said, we want to be a part of Tennessee. And so first of all, I think we need to take a lot of pride in the fact that these companies want to be a part of Tennessee. And so that's where I start with it. And of course, there's going to be lots of issues that arise. I mean, you see it in Nashville. How do we provide the housing for this? Our center does a survey every 6 months of business leaders, and we ask them, what are concerns about employees? And we get, one said, on West Tennessee, we tend to hear more about education. In East Tennessee, we hear more about STEM. In Nashville and Middle Tennessee, we hear more about housing and how do we help employees get housing seems to be high up there. And so there's going to be housing, there's going to be congestion issues and transportation. So lots of issues, but the labor force is ultimately the answer, necessary, right? You can't, these firms won't survive. They won't come without the labor force. And obviously, this goes without saying, we don't have this set of highly skilled people sitting unemployed in Tennessee to take these jobs today. Indeed, you're glad we don't have that problem, right? These are companies coming into, setting aside COVID, an economy that's thriving. And so what are we reliant on? Simple. We're reliant upon interstate migration. And what you see is higher skilled, younger, better educated people more likely to migrate, and those people that have a job. Now, I'm not saying nobody comes to Tennessee without a job, but again, if you look at sort of the history, those are the characteristics. And with those jobs in Middle Tennessee, we will see a lot of people moving into the area. And so look for a lot of in-migration. Now, again, this means, don't wait until this is a problem, right? Get in front of it. We know there's going to be housing issues. We know there's going to be transportation issues as the population grows fast. Well, deal with it today. Don't wait until it becomes a problem. I mean, this is a policy decision, right? And so that's a big part. Now, as you noted, and the question noted, the other side of this is, what about education? And it's true that the Tennessee labor force is undereducated relative to much of the state's population, or much of the other states' populations. I actually have a presentation tomorrow and Tuesday talking about education issues in our state. I didn't bring those into this, but we have fewer people with a 2-year degree. We have fewer people with a high school degree. We have fewer people with a 4-year degree as a share of our economy than the national average. Now, these companies are coming anyway. So they recognize, first of all, that many of the workers will have to come in from outside of the state, and other workers will move up from jobs they have and into better jobs to the extent that's out there. And so we win from those kind of transitions. But we need to help Tennessee's young people, but also Tennessee's already out of traditional school people, continue to improve their education. And it's clear Tennessee has been one of the national leaders in terms of higher education policy. Tennessee Promise in 2014, that was the first statewide free community college program in the country. That started from a Knox Achieves program in Knoxville. Randy Boyd and some other people started, and it's expanded to the state, and it's a great program. And now, by the way, the Haslam family is involved in the Knoxville area, and there's a similar thing in Nashville called Nashville Grad, and it's Knox Promise over here, where we're recognizing that the challenge of helping people get an education is more complicated than just tuition. And so coaching really matters in terms of helping young people get through, particularly if they come from families that are first generation students and they just don't fully understand all that it takes to sign up for classes and work. We try to make the bureaucracy as hard as we can at universities, but I'm mostly thinking about at community colleges, at Nashville State, at Pellissippi State, and go through the range of excellent schools we have. And so we really need to help students stay in school, and programs like Nashville Grad and Knox Promise are great examples. We may need to expand that to the whole state. We need more TCATs, the technical centers in Tennessee, and we have, and this, they do great. They get the students out. We need more of them, and we probably need them linked to high schools because that makes the access easier, allows dual programs. I'm a high school junior, senior. I'm also taking some might be post high school classes. We need to continue to focus on getting our labor force not just ready, but getting it ready and helping it stay ready for a world that's transitioning so fast. So we're making progress. We have good policies. We're not there yet.
I think that's helpful. Randy has a question, Dr. Fox, that talks a little bit about, to the first part of your presentation, you were speaking about the supply chain and the impacts that it's had here in the state of Tennessee. It appears that he's a contractor of some sort because he's asking about construction material pricing. And I know, as we've talked with lots of our contractor clients, that's been a major issue for them recently, is the spike in prices for all of their materials. What's your perspective in the timeline for maybe those returning to a bit more normal, or do you anticipate or see that potentially that the pricing may remain as high as it is currently?
So let me be clear that I'm not an absolute expert on construction materials, but let me talk about the issue at least in some general terms. First of all, what's happening in the economy is demand is recovering faster than supply. And so, housing starts, just using that as an example, are much higher than they have been any time. Now, get this, not since like 2018, when the economy was strong, but since 2007. Extraordinary growth in housing starts. People, with interest rates so low, maybe some of the money that's been given to people. What we found is people spend all that unemployment insurance money. They didn't actually spend that $1,400. I'm talking about the most recent stimulus money. Much of it went into paying off their credit card bills, and credit card liabilities, as you may know, are coming down in the economy. So what's happened though is people are out with demand growing fast for housing, for cars and light vehicles generally, and a range of other things. And the economy, the supply side of the economy simply hasn't been able to respond rapidly enough. It will happen. And by the way, the labor is the same situation. Labor hasn't responded quickly enough. And so that, I think the construction material is a great example of where we have supply chain constraints that will get solved. but it will take some time. And of course, what's also going to happen, in fairness, is demand is going to soften a little bit. We're going to see fewer housing starts likely over the next year at the prices that are necessary today. And so I have great sympathy. I've interacted with a number of people on it, and again, people who are spending their life working in this industry know the reality, the everyday practical aspect of that even better than I do. And I've talked to legislators about this issue who are either in the industry or concerned about their constituents in it. And you know, the good news is the economy responds. High prices brings out supply, but it takes time.
Deborah has a question that I think reflects the sentiment of a lot of people that I talk to. They're a little bit concerned about, you know, what's the next shoe to drop? And maybe it's best asked to you this way, Dr. Fox. What are some of the indicators? What are some of the things that you might watch for the next potential recession? That's where her question sort of lies, is when do you foresee, or, you know, I guess maybe look into your crystal ball and help us think about when the next recession might be, but maybe better asked, what are some of the indicators that you might pay attention to for the potential for that next recession?
Sure. So I'm glad Deborah didn't ask me that question 18 months ago, because I'm pretty sure I would not have said, well, COVID is going to be the problem that's going to lead to the next one. And I joke about that to remind us that as a general rule, when we look at recessions, we don't just slide into them. Usually there's something that precipitates it. And so, you know, and by its very nature, we don't see it coming. If we saw it coming or fully realized the extent of it, we would respond. And so you know, I hate to you know, just kind of sidestep the question a little bit, but we're not going to know it for sure. But let's talk about a few things. First of all, policy is often an issue. And so this is the tightrope I was talking about. If the Fed responds and pushes interest rates up too fast, they could indeed precipitate a recession or some contraction in the economy. So watch Fed policy and how that plays out. Watch how rapidly the federal government reduces the amount of fiscal support. I mean, again, if you have the combination of a lot of fiscal and monetary policy pulled out of the economy at one time, that can be an issue. Obviously, look at the asset markets. Think about what happened in the past. And if we continue to see the financial markets growing at very rapid paces, you know, the suggestion is that a lot of this money that has been put out into the economy has really led simply to higher asset prices. I mean, I know Bitcoin has fallen over the last few days, but you know, things like Bitcoin going from, I was talking with a student recently, former student, he and I a few years ago were just around class, kept talking about Bitcoin. He kept trying to get me to invest in it. He reminded me, I bumped into him the other day. He said it was $3,000 when we were having this discussion, and even at the lower prices, it was $50,000 this morning, right? Well, okay, there's a lot of reasons for that, but all the monetary stimulus plus fiscal stimulus is a part of the story. And if asset prices continue to be bid up without a clear underlying support, as would happen with profitable companies, then that's reason for concern, because we can get a crash there when, you know, the word is bubble that we're thinking about. So look for those kind of indicators. But again, let me remind you that if we look back at the recessions of the past, there was always a factor or two significant that we didn't necessarily see coming that precipitated. Sorry, I'm going to make one last comment, and that is COVID is not the only virus we've had in the last 15 years, right? There have been a number of others of them, SARS and so forth. I mean, just go through the range. I think there's been 5 of them since about 2003 or 4. Will there be another virus out there? How will we respond to that? And so there's a number of economic kind of factors and policy factors I was talking about, but there's these non-policy things that can impact our economy. And so it's, I won't call it a troubling world. I will call it a complicated world in which we all really have to keep our eye on the ball and what's going on, and pay attention to these indicators on an ongoing basis.
I think we'll end with Kathy's question. Kathy talks about the contrast of Nashville's financial condition as compared to the rest of the state. And she's just curious about your perspective and maybe what might need to happen in order to bring all that back a little more in line and ease the disparity between Nashville's financial condition compared to the rest of the state.
So is this as a comment about employment growth, or is it about the fiscal condition of government in Nashville? Do you know?
Yeah, Kathy's question just suggests the financial condition in Nashville compared to, I guess, other larger cities throughout the
Yeah.
state.
Okay, so the financial position as opposed to the economic position, we need to remind ourselves that there are certain really unique characteristics of Tennessee law. One of those is that as property values go up, and trust me, I mean, you all know this better than I, property values in the Nashville area, broadly defined, have shot up. What happens though is we revalue those for property tax purposes. By statute, we must then at the same time reduce the tax rate so that the county governments do not see revenue growth because of value increases. Now, in most of the rest of taxes, you do. You know, if your income just rises, you get more taxes on it. But if your property value goes up, you don't. And so part of Nashville's problem is that its property tax revenues have not kept pace. Now, of course, if there's new property, it comes on the tax rolls and you are getting a lot of new property. That's helping in the Nashville area, but it is not enough given the kind of rapid economic growth you're having. Secondly, on the sales tax side, now, you know, this is kind of a detailed thing, but imagine what happened before COVID and really before e-commerce. What would take place was many of you would come from, you know, Murray County, I'm just making up Cheatham County, and you'd go into Green Hills Mall or someplace like that and shop in Nashville, and you left the property tax revenues in Nashville. This new legislation actually has the tax revenue go to where the person lives if you buy something online. And so what's happening is part of why Nashville is seeing a decline in sales tax revenues is a bunch of people who used to shop in Nashville no longer are. The same people are there, they're spending the same money, but they're leaving the money back in Murray County or Williamson County or fill in the blank. And so it's been impacted Nashville by this flow of how consumption is changing. And so this is all played out in very difficult ways for Nashville. Let me say that while a lot of the economic growth in Middle Tennessee is outside of Davidson County, those core counties, and I would say this about Shelby County, I'd say it about Knox County, I'd say it about Hamilton County, those core counties are essential to the success of those metropolitan areas. And so while the way in which we raise tax revenues in Tennessee can create some difficult challenges for Nashville, you know, we need those counties to be successful. And I guess I would just add to it. I mean, okay, so if somebody comes to Nashville and says, look, if you'll give a tax concession to Oracle, they'll come. Now, who's going to get those jobs? People from, I'm going to guess the majority of people working there will live in surrounding counties. Nashville had to give the tax concession to get them there. The same kind of thing with the area around the convention center and the hockey arena and all these kind of things, the football stadium, and there's some concessions on the sales tax side associated with these. Nashville creates, in some ways, a more difficult fiscal environment, but in order to make the entire area be successful, we need to remember Nashville really matters. Now, I'm not trying to excuse any kind of inappropriate financial behavior. I am saying that the way in which we finance government does raise some challenges, particularly in an area growing as fast as Davidson County and the Middle Tennessee area.
Well, Dr. Fox, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I know the presentation was very helpful and to interact with our guests by answering questions. We really appreciate the time. We would remind everybody that this presentation will be available to you on our YouTube channel, so you can go check that out. Hopefully it's up again tomorrow. And we're thankful that you engaged with us in this virtual format. Again, it's not our preference to do this. We'd love to be with Dr. Fox in person, and hopefully the next time he's with us, we will be able to do that in person. But we're thankful that you all spent some time with us today. We hope you're better for it. Dr. Fox, thanks so much for your time. Hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you all. Have a great day.